Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who obviously has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now this video is another pathetic attempt at verbalizing one of my previous essays, this time written in, I think, October 2016, which deals with what is usually called pseudoscience and what I call scientific pyramids. So if you're going to be patient enough, you'll know what I mean by that term. Well, obviously you wouldn't, but who cares? I'm going to tell you anyway. So let's get started, I guess. So in the recent couple of centuries, I would say that science actually replaced religion as the main sort of cornerstone of civilization, all right? So our whole society now considers science as being the source of truth, rather than, religion as has been previously. So it has become somewhat of almost like a main problem in today's society. Well, not the main problem, but one of the crucial problems to determine what kind of science is the real science. Who of the scientists can we really trust? And like who represents the science as it is, like the pure science, and so on and so forth. Therefore, many attempts have been made in order to distinguish this real science from, crackpot, whatever, not real science, And I'll bring you a couple of examples of failed attempts of doing so. And then we'll talk about more general problems, like why can't we not determine what is real science, all right? And then we'll talk about also some other more general problems in our society, I guess. So yeah, some examples. All right, so in particular, like some people actually propose to develop some sort of tables, to numerically analyze how pseudoscientific you are, or rather, vice versa. And the problems with, the tables would contain questions like, do you have an education in that field where your ideas lie? Do you have any references from other acknowledged scientists? Have you received any grants from the government? Do you have do you invent any new objects? Do you require some old physics to be demolished for your model to be correct, and so on and so forth? And you kind of numerically just add all these questions up, and you get some result, and you kind of arbitrarily set the boundary. Okay, here we have pseudoscientists, if they say got more points, or vice versa, and on the other side you have the real scientists. And the problem with that approach is that if you apply it to especially all the revolutionaries like Einstein or Copernicus, So you would quickly see that they actually are a very prominent pseudoscientists. Okay, so and it's a big problem with that approach. So, all right, so this approach obviously fails. So we cannot distinguish scientists from pseudoscientists just by numerically calculating all these arbitrary criteria that we've set up. All right, but maybe we can approach this from more philosophical, angle. Like, for example, there have been proposed many philosophical criteria for theories to be scientific or not to be scientific. Sounds almost like Shakespeare, Like, for example, there have been a criterion of verificationism where you've had to invent some way to verify your theory. But then people realize that it's not a good criterion because, Christianity would be scientific in this regard because, well, it's God's will, everything is God's will, so you can explain everything through that statement. So then people invented, Karl Popper in particular, invented this criterion of falsificationism, where you have to develop some way of experimentally disproving your theory, so that if such an experiment would be set, like it would be clear whether your theory is true or not. But there's a problem here also. In particular, like for example, if we're talking about the theory of dark matter, right? So in case you don't know, like where it stems from, is the statement like, we observe the motions of galaxies, in particular their rotation, and we see that it does not, it cannot be properly described by the Newtonian gravitation, Newtonian dynamics. And we say, well, okay, let us basically there's not enough mass for you know, the outer stars and galaxy. They rotate too quickly to be bound by gravitation. The centrifugal force would throw them away if they were bound by the gravitational forces from the matter that we observe in the galaxy. So people say, well, okay, let's just arbitrarily insert the missing mass and let's call it dark matter. All right. So, and the problem here is that Newtonian gravitation on its own, it's a falsifiable theory. But Newtonian gravitation with dark matter is no longer a falsifiable theory, because whenever you would have such a discrepancy between Newtonian gravitation and the observations, you would just say, well, it means that the difference is explained by dark matter. We just, you know, insert the necessary quantity of dark matter whenever we need it. So this theory is no longer falsifiable. And yet, somehow, and it's a good question why, people consider the theory of dark matter being scientific theory. Okay? So you can clearly see from these examples, like, even what we consider science today might be pseudo-scientific, if you like, all right? So it's really hard to develop some sort of criterion, at least, you know, for the people who want to justify the current state of science, to distinguish between those two. Like metaphorically speaking, you can imagine like a guard, you know, like a man in armor with a two-handed sword, like guarding the holy citadel of science where only pure scientists reside, and around it is, you know, the fields of barbarism, and he kind of doesn't let all these barbarians through, but he kind of looks back and he sees that in this citadel there are these barbarians, basically, you know, pseudoscientists have already infiltrated whole science. You know, all these revolutionaries that kind of, well, destroyed, like, who was Einstein? Why did he kill ether? And so on and so forth. So, okay, well, I was kind of, you know, it was a hard turn here. But anyway, so what I'm saying is, it's not easy, all right, to develop such a criterion for distinguishing between science and pseudoscience. And well, how can we explain that? Well, I would say that we should look at the more or less modern criticism of the whole philosophy of science. And in particular, I would say that the most profound type of such criticism was represented by people like Feuerabend, constructivists, definitely, like especially radical constructivists, and especially Bruno Latour, I would say. He's one of the most, Andrew Pickering also, but Bruno Latour, he's still alive, and he is one of the most, like, profound critics, I would say, of the, like, you know, naive concepts of how science evolves. And I would definitely recommend you read his books if you have the opportunity. It's really worth it. Let's look at what he says. So basically, one of his main ideas is that the very foundation of science, if we look back in time at the beginning of modernity, you know, the start of 17th century and so on and so forth. So what he says, like, what really distinguishes the European civilization from basically all the rest of the world was that somehow, and it's a very important question, like how the hell did modernity happen and happen in Europe and exactly at that time, but that's a separate question. It's very hard. But by the way, Latour also have a book about it, which is called "We've Never Been Modern," actually. But it's a really cool book. Again, I recommend it for everyone. So anyways, his idea is that at the beginning of 17th century, that there has occurred a division, like of all the world, like arbitrary division in some sense, of the world into society, right, and nature. So if you look at Aboriginal societies, they don't have that division, right? It's everything is kind of intertwined there. Like if you do some wicked crap in your society, it's gonna, you know, anger the gods and they would attack you and so on, or vice versa. Like the God's will impacts society and so on. But in Europe, since the beginning of 17th century, something else occurred. Like they were separated, and there were like strict laws applied in both of these areas, in society and in nature. So in society, we have the collectives of free subjects, right, the free individuums. And that's by the way the same time where, you know, proper lawmaking appeared, constitutions appeared, and so on. So it's not a coincidence, I believe. But at the side of nature, we have this like inanimate, dead nature that is governed by laws of nature again. So, and we have this special sort of kind of a caste of scientists who in society act as an advocates of this nature. So scientists act as almost like a, how do you call it, like the necromancers of nature, so to speak. So they speak on behalf of nature to the society, right? They speak what is true in nature, so that society would organize itself in a proper manner according to what nature is. So again, all of that occurred roughly at the beginning of 17th century, with the works of, you know, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, and all those guys, Galileo, obviously, Kepler, and many others. But okay, so we've had this division into essentially politics and science, right, society and nature. But what have occurred later was that this division was very productive. Like it kind of skyrocketed the civilization upwards. Like this, the growth of our power, you know, was unprecedented in the last 4 centuries, let's say. But the problem was that at some point it started to become more and more clear that this division is not true, you know, in some sense, that there is no purely political and there is no purely scientific objects or subjects, that some, you know, hybrids exist, as Latour calls them. And I have an analogy here, like you have two vessels with different liquids, and as the, you know, when this division occurred into two vessels, so as the level of the liquid was low, there were no problems, and we could progress, and the liquids were rising. But as they started kind of, you know, overflowing, these vessels, they kind of started mixing right there, and we've had all these what Latour calls hybrids, where it is just plain simply obvious that political realm is inseparable from the scientific realm. And I believe that, well, as Latour himself said, like, you know, ozone hole has too much of a social impact to be just a scientific object, you know. It's already a scientific plus political object. And at the same time, he says, like, you know, the interactions of politicians are too chemical to be considered purely, you know, voluntary and free will. So they also stem from or at least relate to science. And you can think about, you know, PR, all these political technologies like neuropolitics and so on, marketing, all of that. It kind of utilizes laws of nature in this political realm to manipulate people. So it becomes more and more clear that there is no such strict separation, that these are essentially parts of a whole, but we've kind of just arbitrarily cut this, or ignored, rather, their connection. All right? So, and I believe that this is exactly the problem that we're dealing with this whole issue of pseudoscience. But let me first give some other examples. Like, obviously, climate change is like the most prominent example of this hybrid, and this is the topic that Latour himself loves very much, maybe because of that. So if you look at it closely, like this agenda of anthropogenic global warming, and this idea of, you know, this consensus of 97%, like what the hell are we dealing with here? Like it's really plainly simple, like thrown into our faces, this idea that we can solve scientific problems by political means, right? We can vote, like all these climate scientists say, well, okay, we have 97% here, and you have obviously 3% right there. Although, I mean, this narrative of 97%, it can be easily deconstructed, but that's not the topic of this discussion. What I'm saying is that they're trying to utilize essentially democratic mechanisms to solve scientific problem. Isn't that like the clearest indication that, like almost acknowledgement that there is no pure science and there is no pure politics anymore, but they're parts of the same, you know, parts of culture essentially. I would say so, yeah. And you know, if you talk to some, you know, like pure scientist from 19th century, he would just laugh at you. He would say, well, you should be ashamed if you're trying to solve a scientific problem by democratic voting. It's just ridiculous, man. Like get yourself together, man. Like give me some better arguments and so on. So, yeah, that's one thing. Another interesting thing, by the way, was that Latour's works on structure of science, like the sociology of science, philosophy of science, they were written in like 1980s, 1990s. There were some brilliant books by him, like Laboratory Life, Pasteurization of France, and so on. We'll talk about that sometime later. But what I'm saying is, it's funny that basically his approach, it kind of brings forth this, well, in a way, social constructivism in science, right? Kind of reinforces it. But at the same time, like, and it can be applied to climate change, which I'm doing right now, right here. But in the recent couple of years, Latour himself have written, like, at least I've seen at least 2 of his articles in the journal Science, like one of the 2 probably major scientific journals, the other one being Nature. So he was kind of in a way apologizing for his own works, because he was saying, well, okay, my previous works definitely say that the climate change might not be real, like, and global warming might be basically nonsense, but at the same time, let's consider blah blah blah. So he was kind of apologizing for his own fundamental work, you know, that kind of nullifies, you know, global warming agenda and so on and so forth. And it's kind of funny in a way, you know, like I almost feel like he was pressed to do that or something, which, by the way, relates to what I'm gonna talk about later. And it's kind of funny. It's kind of sad also, but still funny, I would say. So yeah. And I would say that even the other fields of science, like not only the climate change, but some other fields, definitely also demonstrate this tight connection between society and nature. You know, between politicians, like decision makers. I'm talking about funding and blah blah blah, and scientists. You know, who are kind of supposedly the advocates of nature, of objective reality, and all that jazz. Um, all right, so what did I wanted to talk about later? Yeah, well, okay, let's go to the next topic. So I believe, like returning to this previous discussion about the distinction between science and pseudoscience. So I believe that it is exactly that the our naive concept of science being isolated from the society and from politics in particular is the problem. Like it is the source of this problem of why can't we just naively distinguish between science and pseudoscience? And I would even make a very like a strong point here. Maybe we can have some dramatic music here. I don't know. Yeah, that's pretty good. So my point is that pseudoscience is inherently a political term. It has like absolutely nothing to do with science itself. You know, from inside science, you cannot determine which science is real and which one is pseudoscience. Only when you're dealing with the ensembles of power, the society, the culture, the interactions of scientists, which is again a political thing, you can have a concept of pseudoscience. I believe that basically it's a tool of shaming, in a way. It's like in a political discourse, like in scientific world, calling somebody a pseudoscientist is almost like in political world calling someone a Nazi. It's like the end game, like dialogue is over, like you're just a piece of shit, we're not talking anymore, and so on. And I believe it's a really counterproductive instrument. It's basically a tool to a childish way of dealing with opponents, with scientific opponents, like a bunch of children kind of gathered in their sandbox and are playing. I mean, that's the analogy for scientists, and they're playing there and having fun. But then some other kid comes along, but they say, "Hey, get away from us, you pseudoscientist!" and they kind of shoo him away. That's what we're dealing with here, essentially. Like you're not a true scientist. My big daddy government loves me more than you. That's pretty much like the moral of the story when somebody calls someone pseudoscientist, right? And I believe it's a like it's a very counterproductive practice, in a way, because it kind of only reinforces the established ensembles of scientific / industrial / political powers, and it kind of almost leads to a scientific dictatorship, if you like, right? It suppresses the opposition, and in any system where you suppress the opposition, you get big problems later. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, I would say that the very term pseudoscience is, first, it's of political origin. It has nothing to do with science itself, and two, it is a very malicious way of dealing with opposition. It's a dirty trick, if you like, and it hinders progress, because as these existing hierarchies solidify, it becomes harder and harder to change them in any way, especially again if you're suppressing the opposition, if you're suppressing new and original ideas. All right. So I've talked a lot about politics, political factors. So maybe it's worth to define what I understand by politics, because obviously I'm kind of, you know, broadening this term rather than you know just the governance. I'm talking about politics in a more general sense, and I would define politics as a decision making in the situation of conflict of interests. That would be my definition. So whenever you have some conflicting parties, you have politics. That's what occurs. All these dynamics of power, the rearrangement, the search for allies, the, you know, all these dirty tricks and whatnot. Yeah, so in my opinion, politics might be defined as decision making in the situation of conflict of interests. So that's what, and this very term pseudoscience is the tool of trying to achieve victory in the situation of conflict of interests among scientists. That's what I'm saying. So it's kind of, when somebody calls somebody else pseudoscientists, they first of all acknowledge the very existence of conflict. They're saying, we don't agree with you, all right? And secondly, they claim to be victorious in this conflict. They're saying, you are wrong because you're a pseudoscientist, and I am right because I'm a real scientist. That's what we're dealing with here, like in a nutshell. They're claiming their superiority, and so on and so forth. They're addressing other political groups, other, you know, financial, industrial, scientific, cultural, any type of groups, to join them to like look, my science is better than the science of this guy. He actually is a pseudoscientist, so you should join me. I'm advocating for nature better, right? My constructs, my, you know, mythical objects that I constructed to describe nature are better than the objects that this guy have invented to describe nature. He is basically, you know, he's a crook. He tries to basically, you know, steal your money. He tries to cheat you and so on. So you should believe me and you should abandon him. That's what we're dealing with here. This is the whole premise of the idea of pseudoscience. It's one group of people trying to shoo away another group of people. And as I've said, it has many negative consequences. But okay. I should note here that there is a definite symmetry from the other side also. Like the people who are accused of being pseudoscientists, sometimes they actually kind of accuse themselves even prematurely, even if nobody calls them pseudoscientists. They kind of feel that they are out of the box, and this whole hierarchical structure of science and society in general is so kind of depressing. It's so heavy on them that they kind of bear their burden, and they admit that, okay, you would probably call me a pseudoscientist and so on. So it's not very direct, you know. People kind of understand in the first place what they're dealing with. This whole, you know, vague feeling that you're doing something wrong. It's definitely always on the minds of any type of alternative scientists, and it's really bad. Like we lack this freedom of thought, I would say, in this regard, and it's really hindering the development of society. But anyway, what I was talking about was the symmetry, like from the side of all these alternative scientists, there is this, you know, like the other side of coin. Like here we have the term pseudoscience, but on the other side we have the term mainstream science, or, you know, official science or accepted science. So this, you know, like this Goliath that this brave young alternative scientist would fight and maybe win, and it's all like heroic and, you know, and stuff. So I would say that the whole concept of mainstream science, official, approved, blah 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 science, it's really only the other side of coin of the term pseudoscience, and I believe both of them are counterproductive. Like if you look at all these alternative scientists, like many of them, I'm not saying all of them, some of them are really diligent, but many of them like spend maybe 75 or maybe even 90% of their time fighting the evil Goliath of mainstream science, you know, this David and Goliath kind of thing. So Goliath tries to suppress David, and David tries to bravely fight the Goliath. So this is basically like 100% political propaganda. All of that has nothing to do with science whatsoever. Like the science itself or kind of waits, you know, outside somewhere. And it's really painful to watch usually, I would say. And more than that, this situation, it creates conditions for these alternative scientists, like the evil mainstream science cannot integrate them into their realm, but again tries to suppress them with all this shaming, like you're a pseudoscientist. So what do these guys can do? Like if they really believe in their ideas, the only thing they can do is, like, since they are rejected, well they radicalize, you know, they turn into extremists, you know, they go, you know, how do you call it, underground, and so on and so forth. So and it bears like really strong correlations to what we see like in politics proper, you know, with all these dictatorships that suppress political opposition, and then everyone is surprised, like, what the hell, why everything is crumbling, like, you know, some Gaddafi or Hussein or whatever, like whenever they fall, like whole society crumbles, and everybody says, oh, how good it was under Gaddafi or Hussein or whatever, and now everything is in shambles. Well, guess what? Everything is in shambles because they've suppressed all the opposition, and it was radicalized, and so on, instead of, you know, trying to integrate the opposition into society through, you know, parliamentarism and whatever. So when people don't have the proper way of expressing their opinions, obviously at least some of them would try to, you know, use the other methods, violence in particular. So yeah, there you go. And the same situation with, you know, religious sects. Like whenever a sect is suppressed, it quickly radicalizes, it quickly turns into a bunch of extremists and so on. So it's a very unhealthy situation, and I believe it stems from this very idea that there is a true science and there is a bad science. But okay, well, one could ask here, like, well, you're talking much about, you know, this political aspect, although, you know, I've said in the first place that pseudoscience is not even a scientific term, it's a political term. But what about the nature? Maybe nature and, you know, truth can still help us distinguish between pseudoscience and real science. Like maybe there's some difference with regards to nature between them. And I would say that there is no difference. You see, the problem is that the naive view of nature and truth is that, well, you just go into nature, you do all these experiments, and you uncover the truth about it, right? And that's like, this is what nature says, and we're just receiving its messages. But this is like super naive view of the whole problem. I would say that in real life, what happens is exactly reversed. Like, we should have some consensus in scientific community, and this consensus about the outside world is what we call nature. So it's not that we're addressing nature and it's giving us some answers, but rather it's we're talking about nature with each other. We're presenting our ideas, theories, hypotheses, results of experiments, and it kind of boils everything, like everything boils there, and some result emerges from that. And this result is what we call nature, right? So some concepts, some myths, if you like, some, you know, pantheon of gods, like mythical objects, like electron, like a quantum wave, like a I don't know, well, you name it, historical formation or whatever. All those objects are essentially constructs that emerge from scientific community to describe nature. That's what happens. So in this regard, like, obviously one party would always say that, you know, our concept is what nature is, and the other party would say, you know, no, our concept is what nature is, and they might contradict each other. So no, I'm sorry, you cannot do that. Like the only reasonable concept of truth is, I believe, conventionalism, you know, Poincaré theory. Although, you know, you can find the same ideas in Nietzsche's works with his, you know, new values and perspectivism, what he calls it. It's essentially that, like what Nietzsche said, that there's no facts, there are only interpretations. It's essentially like 100% the same thing. So until there is no agreement in the community, there is no nature. Like we don't know what nature is until we've agreed upon it. All right, so and let's examine a little bit the dynamics of scientific communities. Like, let's say that we have this alternative scientist who has some ideas that clearly contradict at least some of the accepted ideas. So what happens next? Like, can he actually be integrated there still? And I believe he can, but he would need a really strong, solid political campaign. He would need to draw allies from different branches of culture, from different branches of society. You know, he would need friends in the government, in the banks, in the laboratories, in the scientific community. Maybe his friend is an editor of journal who can publish his paper. Maybe his friend is I don't know, gives up some grants or prizes or organizes conferences, or maybe his friend has a laboratory equipment that can help him achieve something, blah, blah, blah. So, and that's all politics, you know, it's an art of agreement, of balancing the interests and whatnot. So theoretically, he can achieve success if he would draw, you know, power from all these sources, and eventually he would have more power than his opponents, the ones that he tries to knock out, you know. So it is indeed possible, but what if he wouldn't have enough resources? And what if the society is solidified so much that we cannot change our science anymore at all? And here I would like to bring up one interesting, like, metaphor, I guess, one interesting, or parable, or how do you call it, which is Stanislav Lem's Perfect Vacuum. So in this book, he has an essay, maybe, or like a story, a fictional story about a guy. His name was Odyssey, by the way. So he went on an odyssey to find a true genius. That's what he did. So, and blah blah blah, he tries to find true genius here and there, but the conclusion that he arrives at like somewhere at the end, was that, you know, humanity looks like a big stream, like a big river, and it's kind of fitting here, you know, this term mainstream. Okay, so humanity is this big river, but what a genius is like a small offshoot of this river that tries to branch away from it, right? To go someplace else to the side. But like, the important point here is that, and again, that's one of the conclusions that this Odyssey arrives at, was that like, in order to be accepted sort of into this mainstream, this genius, first of all, he should be pretty strong. So again, returning to my point about, you know, political powers, First of all, he should be pretty strong, and secondly, he shouldn't branch away too far. The angle should be decent. It shouldn't be very big, so that the other stream could follow him, so that he could, eat away a little bit of land here, and the river would turn a little bit to follow him. That was the point. And like, the extreme end of that curve would be geniuses who are incredibly weak, in the sense that we don't even understand what kind of good their ideas might bring to the world, right? And on the other axis, there is another extreme of geniuses being too complicated. Like they branch so much that we would have to eliminate like half of our concepts that have, like 10,000 years history or even more. So that would be too hard also. So this is the area of geniuses who would never be accepted by society. The ones who are either too complex or too weak in terms of it's not obvious what kind of benefits following them would give to the society, at least in a short-term perspective, or both at the same time, So only geniuses that can be more or less easily understood, they're kind of weird, but still understandable, and strong, so they can allow you to do something with their theories, with their ideas, with their concepts. These geniuses are the ones that we follow. And the problem here is that, it sets such a narrow corridor for change, It's really very hard to turn, to alter, to modify, to adapt this stream to reality, essentially. This is already my commentary. It's not about Lem's book anymore. And this is, and again, like this pseudoscience shaming, it only makes this corridor narrower. It kind of suppresses even these weaker offshoots, like weaker in the sense that not very far digressing from the mainstream, and this is where the concept of scientific pyramid comes in finally, right? So this is my idea, and so what I call scientific pyramid, it stems from the direct analogy with financial pyramids. So, in financial pyramids, you have this unstable economical enterprise, let's call it, that only feeds on newcomers with money that kind of, pump the money in. So the guys who went in first, they kind of benefit the most. But anyway, it is all fed by this increase of debt, right? So the more guys enter, the worse the situation is, because the debt only rises and rises and rises, and eventually it will collapse, right? And the collapse would be more painful the more people have already entered the system. So I believe that we can draw an analogy with scientific systems, like these scientific hierarchies of ideas. Some of them really resemble financial pyramids. And I call them scientific pyramids. All these, again, these black holes, like confinement of quarks, renormalizations, climate change, all that jazz. So I would consider I would consider them as a separate, like tubes of laminar flow in this general mainstream, so to speak. So, and using this analogy, I would say that there are still possibilities to correct the situation, right? So this laminar flow might be mixed by turbulence, let's say, using this analogy again, by impact from neighboring areas of culture, from art, from philosophy, I don't know, from social sciences maybe, and things like that. So there is some possibility for change, right? But it's getting worse and worse each day as we suppress the opposition, suppress the alternative thinkers more and more. But that way or another, I think this whole situation, it only goes to show that we might have already lost, almost like infinite number of other sciences, possible sciences, because again, this whole flow, it's non-linear, it's predetermined, it has this inertia, but at the same time, it's really hard for it to turn. So if we, by some chance, chose one trajectory at the beginning, like almost infinitely many other trajectories would be eliminated. We would never go on that road. We are very determined already with this road. And again, this is one of the paramount properties of nonlinear systems, this strong dependence on the initial conditions, so, even small variation at the beginning of the trajectory impacts the trajectory somewhere down the line very much, right? So yeah, but that might be too conceptual, right? I'm branching off too hard, but all right. And I believe that the very same argument could be brought for, the possible signs that some alien civilization might have. They almost definitely have had different, starting conditions, and therefore their science can be completely different. We might have no idea what it's like, they might not have a concept of mathematics or a concept of number or whatever, but maybe that's even more fundamental than science itself, but that's arguable. I would actually make a video about possible alien life and the possible alien intelligence, maybe even 2 or 3 videos, because I have a really long essay about it. But that's definitely not in this month even, and probably not even in the next one, but we'll see. So, all right, is there a way to rectify this? I already mentioned that the possibility that maybe we can invent some sort of parliament of science. Maybe we can really discuss our problems openly without saying, oh, you're a pseudoscientist, oh, you're a mainstream scientist, without all that childish stuff. I don't know, maybe again, the appearance of the internet gives me a lot of hope in that regard. That eventually it would become clearer and clearer, all that stuff that I talked about before, this conventionalism, perspectivism, constructivism, eventually, because at the moment, all the scientists, they're really at the level of the middle of the 19th century in their understanding of philosophy. They're lagging 150 years at least. And it's very painful to observe again. They have their views on science and society are so naive. Yeah. But maybe one day we'll be able to discuss, to kind of invent some way of progress for science that wouldn't involve direct suppression, bullying, all that good stuff, good totalitarian stuff. All right. Yeah, I kind of talked too much already, although I see this video is going to be shorter than the last one, which is good. But okay, probably one last thing I would add here would be that, to go on a super vague, abstract, general level, I would say that this contradiction that I was playing with here, this contradiction between the constancy of science, science should be something solid, it should represent us as people, it should give us instruments to manipulate nature and so on, and the other pole, so to speak, the need of change, the need to adapt, the need to be fluid, so to speak. This contradiction is actually fundamental for life itself, I would say. And like if we think about life as a genetic code, so genetic code has these two primary objectives. It needs to conserve itself, but at the same time it needs to change, it needs to adapt, right? At least in the next generation, or otherwise, you know, life wouldn't work. So this is kind of the contradiction that I was playing with here. But I'll definitely talk about this contradiction more, and about life and about gender, because gender is directly related to this contradiction, I believe. But all right. So I think I've said everything that I wanted, you know, today. I've probably forgotten something, but well, then we'll talk about that later, I guess. So thank you for watching. The eons are closing.